The interstate stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the Oklahoma plains under the merciless afternoon sun. In the back seat of the stolen sedan, 6-year-old Emma Sullivan pressed her small face against the window, watching the last familiar landmark, a red barn her father had pointed out during their Sunday drives, disappear behind a hill. 4 days. 4 days since the man with cold eyes had grabbed her from the school playground, telling her that Mommy was hurt and needed her right away. 4 days of driving, of strange motels, of being told to stay quiet or something bad would happen to Mommy. Emma's fingers traced the glass as she remembered her father's voice. "If you're ever in real trouble, sweetheart, use these signals. Someone will understand." The car slowed, turning into Murphy's rest stop. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs. This might be her only chance. She had to be brave like Daddy taught her. She had to signal for help. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Master Sergeant Daniel "Danny" Brooks gripped the steering wheel of his weathered pickup truck as he pulled into Murphy's rest stop, the engine's rumble fading to silence. At 34, his once proud military bearing had been worn down by 12 years of service and 3 brutal tours in Afghanistan. The medical discharge papers in his glove compartment cited PTSD, but they couldn't capture the weight that pressed down on his chest every morning when he woke up alone. The duffel bag on his passenger seat contained everything he owned now: a few changes of clothes, his service medals, and a loaded Colt .45 that he'd been contemplating using on himself more and more frequently. He was driving to Florida to see his dying mother, though part of him wondered if he'd make it that far. The voices in his head had been getting louder lately, drowning out any hope he might have had left. 8 months ago, Danny had lost custody of his 7-year-old daughter, Sophia, when his ex-wife, Jennifer, moved to Canada. The court had ruled that his PTSD made him an unfit father, despite his desperate pleas. Sophia's last words to him echoed constantly. "Why can't you come with us, Daddy?" He'd taught her military hand signals during their weekend visits, telling her they were their secret language. Now, those memories felt like knives twisting in his chest. The rest stop diner looked like 1,000 others he'd seen across America. Faded paint, flickering neon sign, and the promise of coffee strong enough to keep him driving through another sleepless night. As he stepped out of his truck, the Oklahoma heat hit him like a wall, reminding him of the deserts where he'd lost too many good soldiers. Inside, the diner was mercifully cool and quiet. Margaret Maggie Thompson, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, looked up from behind the counter. She'd been running this place for 20 years, ever since her own daughter had died in a car accident. Something about the lost look in Danny's eyes reminded her of her own grief. "Coffee?" she asked gently, already reaching for a cup. Danny nodded, choosing a corner booth where he could see the entrance, old habits from combat zones. He ordered a ham sandwich he didn't want and stared out the window at the empty highway. Somewhere out there, Sophia was growing up without him, probably forgetting the father who'd failed to protect her from his own demons. The bell above the door chimed, and Danny looked up to see a man in his 40s entering with a young girl. Something about the way the child moved, careful, controlled, fearful, made Danny's trained instincts snap to attention. The girl's strawberry blonde hair was pulled back in neat braids, and she wore an expensive pink dress that somehow looked wrong on her small frame. Danny had learned to read danger in the subtle details, and every detail about this pair screamed that something was terribly wrong. The man guided the little girl to a booth near the restrooms with a firm hand on her shoulder that looked more like control than affection. Danny watched as they sat down, noting how the girl immediately folded her hands in her lap and stared down at the table. The man, clean-shaven, wearing a navy polo shirt and khakis, looked perfectly normal, the kind of guy you'd see coaching Little League or volunteering at church functions. but Danny's combat instincts were screaming warnings. The man ordered without consulting the girl. 2 grilled cheese sandwiches and 2 Cokes, he told Maggie when she approached their table. His voice was pleasant, unremarkable, but Danny noticed he positioned himself so his body blocked most people's view of the child. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Maggie asked the girl kindly. "Her name's Emma," the man answered quickly before the child could speak. "She's shy around strangers. We're driving to see her grandmother in Texas." The girl, Emma, looked up briefly when Maggie spoke to her, and Danny caught a glimpse of blue eyes that held far too much knowledge for someone so young. There was no joy there, no excitement about visiting Grandma, only a careful wariness that reminded him painfully of the child soldiers he'd encountered overseas, kids who'd learned that survival meant staying invisible. Danny sipped his coffee slowly, using the motion to study the pair more carefully. The man kept checking his phone and glancing around the diner with the calculated awareness of someone who expected trouble. Emma hadn't touched her sandwich when it arrived. She sat perfectly still, occasionally lifting her eyes to scan the room with the same systematic pattern Danny had used to sweep for threats in Afghanistan. That's when he saw it. Emma's right hand moved slightly in her lap, 3 quick gestures that made Danny's blood run cold. Closed fist, open palm, closed fist. A pause. Then repeated. It was subtle, hidden from the man across from her, but unmistakable to anyone who'd been trained to recognize it. The international distress signal. Danny set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, his heart hammering against his ribs. This little girl was signaling for help using military hand signs, the same signs he'd taught Sophia during their weekend visits, telling her they were their special secret language in case she ever needed help. He watched more carefully now, every sense heightened. The man, who'd given his name as Robert Mitchell when paying, never smiled at Emma, never showed any of the casual affection a father would display with his daughter. He cut her sandwich into precise pieces without asking how she liked it, pushed the plate toward her with mechanical efficiency, and returned to his phone. Emma caught Danny's eye again, and this time held his gaze for several seconds. Her small hand moved again, a different signal this time, pointing discreetly to herself, then to the man, then making a cutting motion across her throat. The message was clear. He's dangerous. Help me. Danny's training kicked in. He needed more information before acting, but he also couldn't let them leave. He stood up slowly, walking to the counter where Maggie was refilling sugar dispensers. "That little girl over there," he said quietly. "Have you noticed anything strange about her and the man she's with?" Maggie glanced over discreetly, her maternal instincts immediately engaged. "Now that you mention it, yes. They've been here about 30 minutes, and she hasn't said a single word. Haven't seen her take a bite of food either. And the way he watches her." She shook her head. "Doesn't feel right." "I'm former military," Danny said, keeping his voice low. "That child just gave me a distress signal. The kind we teach soldiers to use when they can't speak." Maggie's face went pale. "Are you certain?" "Dead certain. I need you to call 911, but don't make it obvious. Tell them you have a possible child abduction in progress at Murphy's Rest Stop on I-35. I'll keep watching them." As Maggie moved toward the phone behind the counter, Danny noticed Robert checking his watch and gathering his wallet. They were getting ready to leave. Emma saw it too. Her eyes found Danny's across the diner, and this time she mouthed a single word that hit him like a physical blow. "Help." Danny stood up immediately, his chair scraping against the floor. The sound drew attention from the other patrons. An elderly couple sharing pie, a trucker studying his logbook, a young mother with twin toddlers. The atmosphere in the small diner suddenly felt charged with tension. "Come on, Emma," Robert said, standing and reaching for the girl's arm. "We need to get back on the road." Emma didn't move. She looked up at Robert with undisguised fear, then back at Danny with desperate hope shining in her young eyes. "Excuse me," Danny said, walking over to their table. His voice was calm and friendly, but his body language radiated the controlled danger of a man trained for combat. "I couldn't help but notice. Is everything okay here?" Robert's smile was perfect, just the right mix of polite confusion and slight annoyance. "Everything's fine, thanks. Just traveling with my daughter. You know how kids get when they're tired from a long drive." Danny studied the man's face, noting the micro-expressions that betrayed his discomfort. "That's funny," he said conversationally. "She doesn't look much like you. Different bone structure, different coloring, and she's been trying to get someone's attention for the past half hour." "I don't know what you're talking about," Robert replied, his voice carrying a slight edge now. "Emma, get your jacket." "We're leaving." The little girl still didn't move. Instead, she looked directly at Danny and spoke for the first time since they'd entered the diner. Her voice was small but clear. "My name isn't Emma. It's Sarah." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Every conversation in the diner stopped. The elderly couple looked up from their pie. The trucker set down his coffee. The young mother instinctively pulled her twins closer. Robert's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath before he quickly composed himself. "She's confused," he said with a forced laugh. "She had a fever this morning. Sometimes kids say strange things when they're not feeling well. Don't you, sweetheart?" "I'm not confused," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. "And he's not my daddy. My daddy was tall and had black hair, and he was a soldier like you. This man took me from my school playground 4 days ago." The silence in the diner was deafening. Danny felt something ice-cold settle in his stomach as he looked down at this brave little girl who was risking everything to tell the truth. "Sarah," he said gently, crouching down to her eye level, "how do you know I was a soldier?" "The way you sit and watch everything," she replied. "My daddy did that too, and you recognized my signals. Daddy taught them to me before he died. He said if I was ever in real trouble and couldn't talk, someone would understand." Danny felt his throat tighten. This child's father had been military, had taught her the same survival skills he'd taught Sophia. And now she was using those skills to save her own life. "This is ridiculous," Robert snapped, his composure finally cracking. "You have no right to interfere with a family situation. Sarah, has been through trauma. She's confused about what's real and what isn't. The only trauma she's been through is being kidnapped by you," Danny said, standing up and positioning himself between Robert and the exit. His voice carried the authority of a man who'd commanded troops in combat zones. Through the window, Danny could see police cars pulling into the parking lot, their lights flashing but sirens silent. Maggie had done exactly what he'd asked. Robert saw them too, and his face went white with rage and fear. Robert's eyes darted between the approaching police cars and Danny, his face flushing red with anger and desperation. "This is a mistake," he said, his voice rising. "A huge mistake. I have every legal right to travel with my daughter. You're interfering with a custody arrangement." "She already told us she's not your daughter," Danny replied calmly, never taking his eyes off Robert. "And I believe her." Sarah slid out of the booth and moved closer to Danny, pressing herself against his leg. She was trembling, but her voice remained steady as she looked up at Robert with a courage that amazed everyone watching. "Tell them about the other little girls," she said quietly. "Tell them about the pictures on your phone." Robert's face went ashen. "You don't know what you're talking about. You're just a confused little girl who's been through trauma." "I'm not confused," Sarah's voice carried across the diner with surprising strength. "I remember everything. I remember you grabbing me when I was waiting for Mommy to pick me up from school. I remember you telling me she was hurt and that you were taking me to the hospital. But you didn't take me to any hospital. You took me to a scary place with other kids in cages." The elderly couple gasped. The young mother with twins stood up abruptly, gathering her children protectively. The trucker had his phone out, quietly recording everything. "She's making it up," Robert said desperately, but sweat was beading on his forehead now. "Kids have active imaginations. She's been watching too much television." "I saw the room with all the pictures," Sarah continued, her small voice cutting through his protests like a knife. "Pictures of kids like me. And I heard you talking on the phone about taking me to Mexico, about how much money I was worth." The front door of the diner opened and 3 police officers entered, led by a woman with sergeant stripes. Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez moved with the confident stride of someone who'd handled countless domestic situations, but her expression grew increasingly serious as she took in the scene, the frightened child pressed against a stranger's leg, the man whose body language screamed guilt despite his protests of innocence. "I'm Sergeant Rodriguez," she announced to the room. "We received a call about a possible situation involving a child. Can someone tell me what's going on here?" Robert immediately stepped forward, pulling out his wallet and extracting what appeared to be official documents. "Officer, thank God you're here. This man has been harassing me and my daughter. I have custody papers right here." "Those papers are fake," Sarah said clearly. "My real name is Sarah Elizabeth Sullivan. My mommy is Dr. Jennifer Sullivan, and she works at Denver General Hospital. My daddy was Sergeant James Sullivan, but he died in a car crash 8 months ago. We live at 1247 Oak Street, and our phone number is 303-555-5098. Sergeant Rodriguez knelt down to Sarah's level, her voice gentle but professional. "That's very specific information, sweetheart. Can you tell me anything else about your family?" "My daddy taught me these signals before he died," Sarah said, demonstrating the hand gestures Danny had recognized. "He said if I was ever in trouble and couldn't talk to use them. He was in the Army for 10 years before I was born. He had a scar on his left hand from when he got hurt overseas." Danny stepped forward. "Sergeant, I'm Master Sergeant Daniel Brooks, recently discharged. I recognize those distress signals. They're standard military communication for hostage situations. This child has been systematically taught survival techniques." Sergeant Rodriguez studied Danny's bearing, recognizing another veteran. "And you are?" "A stranger who happened to be in the right place at the right time. This little girl has been signaling for help for the past hour. She's also provided detailed information about what appears to be a larger operation involving other children." Robert's lawyer-trained instincts kicked in. "This is harassment and unlawful detention. I demand to see a warrant. That child has been through psychological trauma from her parents' messy divorce. She's confused, making up stories." "Tell them about the warehouse," Sarah interrupted, looking directly at Sergeant Rodriguez. "The place where you kept us. It smelled like oil, and there were other kids there. Younger ones who cried all the time. And there was a man with a tattoo on his neck who brought us food sometimes." The specificity of Sarah's details made everyone in the diner fall silent. These weren't the vague imaginings of a traumatized child. They were the precise observations of someone who'd been held captive. Sergeant Rodriguez spoke into her radio, calling for backup and requesting a detective. Then she turned back to Robert. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification and those custody papers." Robert handed over a driver's license that read Robert Mitchell and a folder of documents that looked official at first glance. But as Sergeant Rodriguez examined them more closely, her frown deepened. "These custody papers are dated last week," she noted. "But they reference a divorce that was supposedly finalized 2 years ago. And the judge's signature looks unusual." "Sarah Sullivan," one of the other officers said, looking up from his phone. "I just ran that name through the system. There's an active Amber Alert for a 6-year-old Sarah Elizabeth Sullivan, kidnapped 4 days ago from Denver. Parents are Dr. Jennifer Sullivan and deceased Sergeant James Sullivan. Robert's face went completely white. That's impossible. There must be some mistake. The only mistake was thinking you could get away with this, Danny said grimly. Sarah tugged on Danny's shirt. When he looked down, she whispered something that made his blood run cold. He has a gun in his car, and there are other men coming. He kept talking to them on the phone. Danny immediately relayed this information to Sergeant Rodriguez, who quickly radioed for additional units and requested that Robert's vehicle be secured and searched. "You're making a terrible mistake," Robert said, his voice now carrying a note of desperation. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. This goes deeper than you think. There are people involved in this who—" "Who what?" Sergeant Rodriguez asked sharply. "Who are going to protect you? I doubt that very much." Sarah looked up at Danny with eyes that held too much knowledge for her 6 years. "Can you make sure I get back to my mommy?" she asked quietly. "I've been trying to be brave like Daddy taught me, but I just want to go home." Danny felt his throat constrict with emotion. This little girl's courage reminded him painfully of Sophia, but also of every soldier he'd served with who'd faced impossible odds with quiet determination. "I promise," he said solemnly. "But first, we need to make sure this man can never hurt you or any other children again." As more police units arrived and began processing the scene, Sarah provided investigators with a wealth of information that would prove crucial. She described the route they'd taken from Denver, the motel where they'd stayed the first night, the warehouse where other children were being held, and most importantly, the phone conversations she'd overheard about buyers waiting in Mexico. Robert Mitchell, whose real name they would soon discover was Robert Mason, was taken into custody on charges of kidnapping, child trafficking, and possession of forged documents. But as Danny watched the man being led away in handcuffs, he couldn't shake Sarah's warning about other men coming. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The investigation that followed Sarah's rescue unfolded like a carefully constructed house of cards, collapsing in slow motion. In the sterile conference room of the FBI field office in Oklahoma City, Agent Maria Santos spread photographs and documents across the long table with methodical precision. Each piece of evidence painted a more horrifying picture than the last, revealing a trafficking network so sophisticated and far-reaching that it challenged everything the investigators thought they knew about organized crime in America. Danny sat beside Sarah as federal agents worked through the night, analyzing the intelligence she had provided during her rescue. The little girl's photographic memory had proven invaluable. She could describe with startling accuracy the layout of the warehouse where she'd been held, the faces of her captors, the voices of buyers she'd overheard making arrangements by phone. Her detailed observations were being cross-referenced with surveillance footage, financial records, and intercepted communications that painted a picture of a criminal enterprise operating with military-level organization. "Sarah," Agent Santos said gently, placing a thick file in front of them. "We need to ask you some difficult questions about what you saw and heard during your captivity. But first, I want you to understand that none of what happened to you was your fault. None of it." Sarah nodded solemnly, her small hand finding Danny's larger one. In the 4 days since her rescue, she had barely left his side, and the bond they'd formed had become her anchor in a world that suddenly felt too dangerous and unpredictable. Danny had taken emergency leave from his journey to Florida, unable to abandon this brave child who reminded him so painfully of his own lost daughter. "The man you knew as Robert Mitchell," Agent Santos began carefully. "His real name is Robert Fletcher. He's been operating trafficking rings for over 8 years. Sarah, based on the records we've recovered, you were victim number 847 in his network's database." The number hit Danny like a physical blow. 847 children. While he'd been overseas fighting foreign enemies, nearly 1,000 American children had disappeared into a nightmare that operated right here on home soil. The scale of it was almost incomprehensible, a systematic industry built on the exploitation of the most vulnerable members of society. We've been able to identify and locate 412 of the previous victims, Agent Santos continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Most were recovered and returned to families over the years, but she paused, looking at Sarah with infinite gentleness. Honey, some of the children who went through this experience didn't make it home. Sarah's grip on Danny's hand tightened, but her voice remained steady. How many? We're still investigating, but we believe it might be as many as 63 children over the past 8 years. Some died from neglect or abuse. Others were killed when they tried to escape or became too difficult to manage. The silence in the room was deafening. Danny felt something inside his chest crack open, a wound he thought had healed from his combat tours, suddenly bleeding fresh pain. All those children gone forever, while people like him had been fighting enemies thousands of miles away, ignorant of the predators operating in their own communities. Agent Santos slid another document across the table, this one bearing official FBI headers and classification stamps. Sarah, we've discovered something else that's very important. You weren't chosen randomly. Your kidnapping was specifically planned and targeted. The document was a detailed profile with Sarah's photograph, her school schedule, her family information, and disturbingly, details about her father's death 8 months earlier. At the top of the page was a red stamp that made Danny's blood run cold. High value, military orphan, priority target. They target military families specifically, Agent Santos explained, her voice heavy with disgust. Children of deceased service members are considered premium merchandise because they're often more disciplined, less likely to cause problems during transport, and she struggled to continue. Because their surviving parents are usually dealing with grief and trauma, making them easier targets for manipulation and less likely to be believed if they report suspicious activity. Sarah looked up at Danny with eyes that held too much understanding for someone so young. That's why he knew about Daddy being dead, isn't it? He knew Daddy was gone, and that made me worth more money to the bad people. The matter-of-fact way she said it, as if discussing her own value as a commodity in a marketplace, broke something fundamental inside Danny. This little girl had been forced to understand concepts that would traumatize most adults, had been reduced to a price tag in a ledger of human misery. But the worst revelation was yet to come. Agent Santos opened another file, this one marked with multiple security classifications and bearing the seal of military intelligence. Her hands trembled slightly as she prepared to share information that would change everything they thought they knew about Sarah's situation. The investigation has uncovered something we never expected, she said slowly. Sarah's father, Sergeant James Sullivan, was investigating this same trafficking network before his death. His car accident wasn't an accident. Danny felt the floor drop out from under him. What are you saying? James Sullivan had been working with a joint military intelligence task force, investigating reports of military families being systematically targeted by trafficking organizations. He'd gotten too close to the truth, had identified key players in the network, and was preparing to expose the entire operation. The car crash that killed him was orchestrated by the same people who kidnapped Sarah. Sarah's face went completely white, her small body trembling as the full implications sank in. They killed my daddy? Agent Santos nodded grimly. We believe he was murdered to stop his investigation and prevent him from exposing the network. And Sarah, they took you specifically to retrieve evidence he'd hidden. They thought if they had you, your mother would give them whatever your father had discovered about their operation. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Sarah's quiet crying. Danny pulled her closer, his own vision blurring with rage and grief. This brave little girl hadn't just survived a random kidnapping, she'd survived a targeted assassination plot that had already claimed her father's life and was designed to destroy any evidence of a criminal conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of law enforcement and government. "Where is this evidence?" Danny asked, his voice deadly quiet. "That's what we need Sarah's help to find," Agent Santos replied. "Sarah, did your daddy ever give you anything special to keep safe, or tell you about a hiding place that was just between the two of you?" Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, thinking carefully. When she spoke, her voice was small but clear. "He gave me a special teddy bear after Mommy went back to work at the hospital full-time. He said it was our secret and that I should never let anyone else have it, not even Mommy. He said it was very important and that someday it might help protect other children." "Where is this bear now?" "At home, in my bedroom. Hidden in the special place Daddy showed me behind the loose panel in my closet wall." Agent Santos exchanged significant glances with her colleagues. "Sarah, we're going to need to go to your house. With your permission and your mother's, we'd like you to show us this hiding place." "Will the bad men try to hurt Mommy if we go home?" Sarah asked, her voice small and frightened. "We'll have protection," Danny said firmly. "I'll be with you every step of the way, I promise." But even as he made the promise, Danny couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something much bigger and more dangerous than anyone realized. If James Sullivan had died for his investigation, and if Sarah had been targeted because of what he'd discovered, then the evidence they were about to uncover could expose a conspiracy that reached far beyond a single trafficking ring. The drive to Denver took place in a heavily secured convoy. 2 FBI vehicles, a state police escort, and Danny riding in the back seat beside Sarah, who clutched a new stuffed animal that Agent Santos had given her. She'd been remarkably calm throughout the journey, occasionally pointing out landmarks and talking about happier memories of trips with her parents. Dr. Jennifer Sullivan met them at the front door of the modest 2-story house at 1247 Oak Street, and the reunion between mother and daughter was both heartbreaking and beautiful. Jennifer had lost significant weight during Sarah's disappearance, her face gaunt with worry and sleepless nights, but the moment she saw her daughter safe and alive, years seemed to fall away from her features. Inside the house, Sarah led them upstairs to her bedroom, a cheerful space decorated with drawings of horses and butterflies that felt almost surreal given what they'd all been through. She went directly to her closet, moved aside some clothes with practiced efficiency, and revealed a small panel in the wall that had been expertly concealed. The teddy bear inside looked ordinary, except for a carefully sewn zipper in its back. When Agent Santos opened it with surgical precision, she found a micro SD card that would prove to contain the most damaging evidence against a trafficking network that had operated with impunity for nearly a decade, evidence that would expose corruption reaching into federal agencies, state courts, and local law enforcement across multiple states. The warehouse raid began at 11:47 p.m., exactly 6 hours after Sarah's rescue at Murphy's rest stop. Danny crouched beside the SWAT team commander behind a line of police vehicles, his military training automatically cataloging the tactical situation. The abandoned industrial complex on the outskirts of Tulsa looked like 100 others he'd seen. Rusted metal siding, broken windows, and the kind of isolation that made it perfect for hiding unspeakable crimes. Sarah's detailed descriptions had led them here with frightening accuracy. She'd remembered the smell of motor oil, the sound of trains in the distance, the way the building's metal walls made echoing noises when it rained. Most remarkably, she'd drawn a surprisingly accurate floor plan from memory, marking where the children were kept, where the guards usually stationed themselves, and which doors were used for bringing in new victims. "Movement on the north side," came the voice through Danny's borrowed radio headset. FBI Special Agent Maria Santos had reluctantly allowed him to observe the operation after Sarah had specifically requested his presence. The 6-year-old had formed an unshakable trust in the soldier who'd recognized her signals, and her cooperation was crucial for what they might find inside. Through night vision scopes, the assault team could see figures moving around the building's perimeter. Robert Mason had been right about one thing. This operation was bigger than anyone had initially realized. Intercepted phone calls from his arrest had revealed a network spanning multiple states, with buyers already en route from Mexico and Canada. Sarah said there were usually 3 guards at night, Danny whispered into his headset. 2 inside, 1 outside. The children are kept in the back section, in what used to be storage rooms. Agent Santos nodded grimly. They'd already identified the building as a former auto parts warehouse that had been abandoned for 2 years. Somehow, Mason's organization had been using it as a way station for trafficking children across state lines, probably moving victims every few days to avoid detection. The radio crackled. Thermal imaging shows at least 15 heat signatures in the building. Most appear to be small, consistent with children. Danny felt his stomach clench. 15 children. Sarah had told them there were lots of other kids, but hearing the actual number made it real in a way that hit him like a physical blow. Somewhere in that building were children as young as 4 or 5, trapped in the same nightmare Sarah had escaped. On my count, the SWAT commander's voice cut through the radio chatter. 3, 2, 1, go, go, go. The coordinated assault began with the controlled explosion of a flashbang grenade at the front entrance. Danny watched through binoculars as black-clad figures poured through multiple entry points simultaneously, their movements precise and deadly efficient. The sounds that followed, shouting, breaking glass, the sharp crack of gunfire, reminded him painfully of combat zones halfway around the world. But this time, instead of fighting foreign enemies, they were fighting monsters who preyed on American children. "First guard down," came the report. "Second guard surrendering, moving to secure the children's area." Then came a voice that made everyone freeze. "Jesus Christ, command! You need to see this!" Danny's hands tightened on his binoculars as he watched officers emerging from the building, many of them carrying small, wrapped figures. The children were being brought out one by one, some walking with assistance, others being carried by officers who looked shaken by what they'd found inside. Agent Santos touched Danny's shoulder. "Sarah asked for you specifically. She's in the mobile command unit helping us identify some of the other children." "Are you ready for this?" Danny nodded, though he wasn't sure anyone could be ready for what they were about to see. As they walked toward the command unit, a converted RV bristling with communication equipment, he could see paramedics setting up a triage area. Some of the rescued children were being treated for malnutrition and dehydration. Others showed signs of physical abuse that made hardened cops turn away in disgust. Inside the command unit, Sarah sat at a small table, still wearing the same pink dress from the rest stop but now draped in a police officer's jacket. She looked incredibly small and fragile, but her voice was steady as she spoke with a FBI child psychologist. "That's Tommy," she was saying, pointing to a photograph on a tablet screen. "He's 7, I think. He was really scared and he cried a lot at night. And that's Maria. She doesn't speak much English, but she's really nice. She shared her crackers with me when I was hungry." When Sarah saw Danny, her composed facade finally cracked. She ran to him, wrapping her small arms around his waist and burying her face against his shirt. For the first time since her rescue, she allowed herself to cry. Deep, shuddering sobs that seemed to come from somewhere far too deep for someone so young. "I was so scared they would hurt them," she whispered against his shirt. "I tried to take care of the little ones, but I couldn't protect them all. There was this man with mean eyes who said if anyone tried to escape, he would hurt the others." Danny knelt down to her level, his own eyes burning with unshed tears. "You did everything right, Sarah. You were braver than most soldiers I know, and because of your courage, all those children are safe now." Agent Santos approached with an update that made everyone in the command unit fall silent. "We've recovered 17 children total, ages 4 to 13. 12 are American citizens, 5 appear to be foreign nationals. Medical is saying most are malnourished but alive. However," she paused, looking directly at Sarah. "Honey, we found something else in the building, a room with photographs and documents. We think some children didn't make it out alive." Sarah's grip on Danny tightened. "I know," she said quietly. "I saw them take away a little boy who got sick. He never came back. And there was a girl who tried to run away." She couldn't finish the sentence. The radio crackled with another update. "We've got company. Multiple vehicles approaching fast from the east. Looks like our friends decided to come back." Through the command unit's windows, they could see headlights racing across the industrial complex, 3 SUVs moving with military precision toward the warehouse. Mason's associates had returned, probably expecting to find a normal transfer operation, not a law enforcement raid. "All units, defensive positions," came the SWAT commander's voice. "We've got hostiles incoming. Protect the children at all costs." What followed was a firefight that lasted 17 minutes and would make headlines across the nation. The traffickers, armed with automatic weapons and apparently willing to kill to protect their operation, engaged police in a running battle across the industrial complex. Danny found himself in the impossible position of wanting to join the fight while knowing his most important job was protecting Sarah. She sat beside him in the command unit, remarkably calm for a child in the middle of a war zone, occasionally providing tactical information about the approaching vehicles. "The red SUV," she said during a brief lull in the gunfire, "that's Carlos's car. He has a gun with a long barrel. And the black truck, that's where they keep the chains and the scary stuff." Her matter-of-fact delivery of such horrific information reminded Danny that this little girl had been forced to grow up too fast, to learn survival skills that no child should ever need. When the gunfire finally stopped, 3 traffickers were dead, 2 were wounded and in custody, and miraculously, no law enforcement officers had been seriously injured. But the real victory was in the 17 children who were now free, including Sarah Elizabeth Sullivan, whose courage had brought down an entire trafficking network. As dawn broke over the Oklahoma plains, Sarah sat in the command unit, finally allowing herself to believe that she was truly safe. But for Danny, watching her process the trauma of what she'd endured, the real battle was just beginning. These children would need years of healing, and the men responsible for their suffering would have to face justice. The warehouse raid had been a success, but it had also revealed the true scope of the horror that Sarah had survived. The devastating truth began to unravel 3 days after the warehouse raid in the sterile conference room of the FBI field office in Oklahoma City. Danny sat beside Sarah as federal agents spread photographs and documents across the long table, evidence that painted a picture so horrific it made seasoned investigators struggle to maintain their composure. Agent Santos placed a thick file in front of them, her hands trembling slightly. "Sarah, we need to ask you some difficult questions about what you saw and heard. But first, I want you to know that none of this is your fault. None of it." Sarah nodded solemnly, her small hand finding Danny's larger one. In the 3 days since her rescue, she'd barely left his side, and the makeshift family they'd formed had become her anchor in a world that suddenly felt too dangerous and unpredictable. "The man you knew as Robert Mason," Agent Santos began carefully. "His real name was Robert Fletcher. He's been operating trafficking rings for over 8 years. Sarah, you were victim number 847 in his network's records." The number hit Danny like a physical blow. 847 children. While he'd been overseas fighting wars, nearly 1,000 American children had disappeared into a nightmare that operated right here on home soil. We've been able to identify 312 of the previous victims, Agent Santos continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Most were recovered and returned to families, but... She paused, looking at Sarah with infinite gentleness. Honey, some of the children who went through this didn't make it home. Sarah's grip on Danny's hand tightened. How many? She asked quietly. We don't know yet, but we think it might be as many as 63 children over the past 8 years. The silence in the room was deafening. Danny felt something inside his chest crack open. A wound he thought had healed from his combat tours suddenly bleeding fresh pain. All those children, gone forever, while people like him had been fighting enemies thousands of miles away, ignorant of the predators operating in their own backyard. There's something else, Agent Santos said, sliding another document across the table. Sarah, we've discovered why you specifically were targeted. It wasn't random. The document was a detailed profile with Sarah's photograph, her school schedule, her family information, and, disturbingly, details about her father's death. At the top of the page was a red stamp, High Value, Military Orphan. Danny's blood ran cold as he read the clinical analysis of Sarah's marketability. The document described her as intelligent, trainable, from military background, excellent for overseas buyers who prefer educated American children. They target military families specifically, Agent Santos explained. Children of deceased service members are considered premium merchandise because they're often more disciplined, less likely to cause problems, and, she struggled to continue, because their surviving parents are usually dealing with grief and trauma, making them easier targets for manipulation. Sarah looked up at Danny with eyes that held too much understanding. That's why he knew about Daddy, isn't it? He knew Daddy was dead, and that made me worth more money. The matter-of-fact way she said it, as if discussing her own value as a commodity, broke something fundamental inside Danny. This little girl had been forced to understand concepts that would traumatize most adults. But the worst revelation was yet to come. Agent Santos opened another file, this one marked with multiple security classifications. The investigation has uncovered something we never expected. Sarah's father, Sergeant James Sullivan, was investigating this same trafficking network before his death. His car accident wasn't an accident. Danny felt the floor drop out from under him. What are you saying? James Sullivan had been working with military intelligence, investigating reports of military families being targeted by trafficking organizations. He'd gotten too close to the truth. The car crash that killed him was orchestrated by the same people who kidnapped Sarah. Sarah's face went completely white. They killed my daddy? Agent Santos nodded grimly. We believe he was murdered to stop his investigation. And Sarah, they took you specifically to retrieve evidence he'd hidden. They thought if they had you, your mother would give them whatever your father had discovered. The room fell silent except for the sound of Sarah's quiet crying. Danny pulled her closer, his own vision blurring with rage and grief. This brave little girl hadn't just survived kidnapping. She'd survived a targeted assassination plot that had already claimed her father's life. Where is this evidence? Danny asked, his voice deadly quiet. That's what we need Sarah's help to find, Agent Santos said. Sarah, did your daddy ever give you anything special to keep safe? Or tell you about a hiding place that was just between the two of you? Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, thinking carefully. He gave me a special teddy bear after Mommy went back to work at the hospital. He said it was our secret and that I should never let anyone else have it, not even Mommy. Where is this bear now? At home, in my bedroom, hidden in the special place Daddy showed me. Agent Santos exchanged glances with her colleagues. "Sarah, we're going to need to go to your house. With your permission and your mother's, we'd like you to show us this hiding place." "Will the bad men try to hurt Mommy if we go home?" Sarah asked, her voice small and frightened. "We'll have protection," Danny said firmly. "I'll be with you every step of the way." But even as he made the promise, Danny couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something much bigger and more dangerous than anyone realized. If James Sullivan had died for his investigation, and if Sarah had been targeted because of what he'd discovered, then the evidence they were about to uncover could expose a conspiracy that reached far beyond a single trafficking ring. The drive to Denver took place in a heavily secured convoy, 2 FBI vehicles, a police escort, and Danny riding in the back seat beside Sarah, who clutched a new stuffed animal that Agent Santos had given her. She'd been remarkably calm throughout the journey, occasionally pointing out landmarks and talking about happier memories of trips with her parents. But as they approached the suburban neighborhood where she'd grown up, Sarah grew increasingly quiet. The house at 1247 Oak Street looked perfectly normal. A modest 2-story colonial with a well-maintained front yard and a tire swing hanging from an old oak tree. Dr. Jennifer Sullivan met them at the front door, and the reunion between mother and daughter was both heartbreaking and beautiful. Jennifer had lost weight during Sarah's disappearance, her face gaunt with worry and sleepless nights, but the moment she saw her daughter safe, years seemed to fall away from her features. "I never stopped looking for you," Jennifer whispered as she held Sarah tightly. "Not for one single moment." "I know, Mommy," Sarah replied. "I knew you would find me. Daddy taught me to never give up, even when things looked scary." Inside the house, Sarah led them upstairs to her bedroom, a cheerful space decorated with drawings of horses and butterflies that felt almost surreal given what they'd all been through. She went directly to her closet, moved aside some clothes, and revealed a small panel in the wall that had been expertly concealed. "Daddy showed me this hiding place," she explained. "He said it was left over from when the house was built, but that we could use it for our special secrets." Inside the hidden compartment was a teddy bear that looked ordinary except for a small zipper sewn into its back. When Agent Santos carefully opened it, she found a micro SD card containing what would prove to be the most damaging evidence against a trafficking network that had operated with impunity for nearly a decade. But as they examined James Sullivan's hidden investigation files, Danny realized that Sarah's ordeal was far from over. The evidence implicated people in positions of power, law enforcement officials, judges, politicians, who had been enabling and protecting the trafficking operation. Sarah Elizabeth Sullivan hadn't just survived kidnapping. She'd become the key witness in a case that would expose corruption at the highest levels of government, and that made her more valuable and more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The contents of James Sullivan's hidden SD card sent shockwaves through every level of law enforcement involved in the case. In the secure conference room of the FBI field office, Agent Santos and her team worked through the night analyzing hundreds of files, photographs, financial records, and secretly recorded conversations that painted a picture of corruption so extensive it seemed almost impossible to believe. Danny sat beside Sarah as federal prosecutors carefully explained what her father had discovered before his death. The little girl listened with the same grave attention she'd shown throughout her ordeal, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated an intelligence far beyond her 6 years. "Your daddy was very smart and very brave," Agent Santos told Sarah gently. "He found out that the people who were supposed to protect children were actually helping the bad people hurt them instead." James Sullivan's investigation had uncovered a conspiracy that reached from local law enforcement to federal agencies. The trafficking network had been operating under the protection of corrupt officials who were paid handsomely to look the other way, manipulate evidence, and ensure that cases against traffickers either disappeared or resulted in minimal sentences. The evidence included recorded phone conversations between Robert Fletcher and Detective Mark Harrison of the Denver Police Department, who had been feeding the trafficking network information about ongoing investigations. Bank records showed regular payments from shell companies connected to the trafficking operation to Harrison's offshore accounts. But Harrison was just the beginning. Judge Patricia Caldwell of the Denver Family Court had been systematically placing vulnerable children in the custody of people connected to the trafficking network, often overriding social workers' recommendations and ignoring clear evidence of abuse. Her bank records showed deposits totaling over $800,000 from the same shell companies that had paid Detective Harrison. Most shocking of all was the involvement of Assistant District Attorney Michael Torres, who had been deliberately sabotaging prosecutions of suspected traffickers. Cases that should have resulted in lengthy prison sentences instead ended in plea bargains, reduced charges, or dismissals on technical grounds. Torres had received over $1.2 million in payments over a 3-year period. "Sarah," Agent Santos said carefully, "we need you to understand something very important. The people your daddy was investigating, some of them knew he was getting close to the truth. We think they may have ordered his death to stop his investigation." Sarah nodded solemnly. "So they killed Daddy to keep hurting other kids." The simple, devastating accuracy of her statement left everyone in the room speechless for several moments. Danny felt rage burning in his chest like acid. This little girl's father had died trying to protect children, and the very people who should have honored his sacrifice had instead targeted his daughter for the same fate. But the most shocking revelation came when Agent Santos opened a file labeled Operation Safe Harbor. James Sullivan had discovered that the trafficking network was being protected not just by local corruption, but by a federal program that was supposed to combat trafficking. "Your father found evidence that Operation Safe Harbor, which was created to rescue trafficked children, was actually being used to identify and target vulnerable kids," Agent Santos explained. People in the program were passing information about at-risk children to traffickers instead of protecting them. The scope of the betrayal was almost incomprehensible. A federal program funded with taxpayer money and designed to save children had been weaponized to deliver them into the hands of predators. Danny studied the documents with growing horror. How many children were targeted through this program? "We're still investigating, but preliminary numbers suggest over 400 children in the past 5 years. Sarah was identified as a target through Safe Harbor after her father's death was reported through military channels." Sarah looked up at Danny with eyes that held far too much understanding. "That's why they knew about Daddy being dead, isn't it? The people who were supposed to help kids were the ones hurting them instead." Agent Santos nodded. "The same day your father's death was reported, your information was entered into a targeting database. Robert Fletcher received your profile within 48 hours. The calculated nature of Sarah's targeting made Danny's hands shake with suppressed fury. This hadn't been a crime of opportunity. It had been a carefully planned operation designed to silence James Sullivan's investigation and eliminate any evidence he might have left behind. But James Sullivan had been smarter than his killers realized. The evidence hidden in Sarah's teddy bear wasn't just documentation of the trafficking network, it was a detailed blueprint of the entire corruption conspiracy, complete with recorded conversations, financial records, and photographic evidence of high-ranking officials meeting with known traffickers. "There's something else," Agent Santos said, opening another file. "Your father wasn't working alone. He was part of a group of military investigators who had been tracking trafficking networks that specifically target military families." They called themselves the Guardian Project. The Guardian Project files revealed a shadow network of current and former military personnel who had been conducting their own investigation into trafficking operations that targeted military families. They'd discovered that children of deceased service members were being systematically identified and sold to overseas buyers who valued American military discipline and training. Your father was the lead investigator for Guardian Project, Agent Santos continued. When he was killed, the other members went underground to protect themselves and their families. But his death wasn't in vain, Sarah. The evidence he gathered is going to bring down this entire network. Danny looked through the Guardian Project files, recognizing names of soldiers he'd served with, men and women who had risked their lives overseas, only to return home and discover that American children were being trafficked by the very people they'd sworn to protect. "What happens now?" Danny asked. Agent Santos's expression was grim but determined. "Now we have enough evidence to bring down everyone involved. Federal grand juries are being convened in 4 states. We're looking at RICO charges against the entire network. Conspiracy, racketeering, murder, trafficking, corruption of federal programs." "But Sarah," she continued, turning to the little girl, "this means you're going to be the most important witness in one of the biggest federal cases in decades. There are going to be people who will try very hard to make sure you can't testify." Sarah's grip on Danny's hand tightened, but her voice remained steady. "Will they try to hurt Mommy again?" "We're not going to let that happen," Danny said firmly. "I promise you, Sarah. No one is going to hurt you or your mother ever again." But even as he made the promise, Danny knew that the people they were fighting had already proven they were willing to kill to protect their operation. James Sullivan's death was proof of that, and now his daughter, a 6-year-old girl whose only crime was surviving what they'd done to her, had become the key to exposing a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. Agent Santos closed the files and looked directly at Sarah. "Sweetheart, your daddy would be so proud of you. Because of your courage, because you never gave up and kept signaling for help, we're going to be able to save hundreds of other children and put the bad people in prison where they can never hurt anyone again." Sarah nodded solemnly. "Daddy always said that protecting other people was the most important job anyone could have. I want to finish what he started." Looking at this remarkable little girl, Danny realized that Sarah Elizabeth Sullivan had become something unprecedented, a 6-year-old who would take down a federal conspiracy and honor her father's sacrifice by ensuring that his investigation would finally see justice. But first, they would have to keep her alive long enough to testify. The evidence from James Sullivan's investigation would eventually lead to the arrest of 127 people in 12 states, the rescue of over 300 children, and the complete dismantling of a trafficking network that had operated with impunity for nearly a decade. But that victory would come at a cost that none of them could have anticipated. 18 months after that fateful afternoon at Murphy's Rest Stop, the morning sun streamed through the windows of the newly constructed James Sullivan Center for Child Protection in Oklahoma City. Danny Brooks, now the center's director of security and survivor advocacy, stood in the main lobby watching children arrive for their morning programs. The building bore a bronze plaque dedicating it to Sergeant James Sullivan, whose courage and sacrifice exposed the darkness and brought children home to the light. Sarah Elizabeth Sullivan, now 8 years old and noticeably taller, walked through the front doors with her mother, Dr. Jennifer Sullivan, who had relocated to Oklahoma to be closer to the center where her daughter's testimony had helped create. Sarah wore the same confident bearing she'd shown in that diner 2 years ago, but now it was tempered with the wisdom of someone who had not only survived trauma, but had transformed it into purpose. "Good morning, Mr. Danny," Sarah called out, using the title she'd insisted on since the center opened. Behind her, 3 younger children followed, siblings who had been rescued from a trafficking ring in Texas, kids who still sometimes woke up screaming, but who had learned to trust again because Sarah had shown them it was possible. The federal trials had been everything Agent Santos had predicted and more. Over the course of 14 months, federal prosecutors had systematically dismantled the entire corruption network that James Sullivan had died investigating. Detective Mark Harrison received 45 years in federal prison. Judge Patricia Caldwell was sentenced to life without parole. Assistant District Attorney Michael Torres took a plea deal that would keep him in prison for 30 years in exchange for testifying against higher-level conspirators. Robert Fletcher, the man who had kidnapped Sarah from her school playground, received multiple life sentences for trafficking, murder, and conspiracy. But perhaps, more importantly, his cooperation had led to the identification and rescue of 127 additional children who were still being held by the network. The Guardian Project, the underground network of military investigators that James Sullivan had helped establish, had emerged from the shadows to become an official joint task force between the FBI and military intelligence. Danny had been recruited to lead their field operations, using his combat experience to coordinate rescue missions across the country. But the real victory was measured in smaller, more personal triumphs. Sarah had testified before Congress about the need for better protection of military families from trafficking networks. Her poise and intelligence had impressed even the most hardened politicians, and her testimony had led to the passage of the Sullivan Act, which created new federal protections for children of deceased service members. Dr. Jennifer Sullivan had taken a position as the center's chief medical officer, specializing in treating the physical and psychological trauma suffered by trafficking survivors. She had remarried 6 months ago to Danny Brooks in a ceremony that Sarah had helped plan and in which she'd served as maid of honor. "We have some special visitors today," Danny announced to the children gathered in the lobby. Through the front doors came Agent Maria Santos, now promoted to Special Agent in charge of the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force, accompanied by Maggie Thompson from Murphy's Rest Stop. Maggie, who had received a Presidential Medal of Freedom for her role in Sarah's rescue, had become a regular volunteer at the center. She'd closed her diner and moved to Oklahoma City to dedicate her remaining years to protecting children, saying that watching Sarah's courage had reminded her why some fights were worth having. "Miss Maggie!" Sarah exclaimed, running to embrace the woman who had made that crucial phone call to 911. "Did you bring the cookies?" "Of course, sweetheart," Maggie replied, producing a tin of homemade chocolate chip cookies. "And I brought something else, too." She handed Sarah an envelope bearing official government seals. Inside was a letter from the President of the United States, officially recognizing Sarah Elizabeth Sullivan as the youngest recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom for exceptional courage in the face of danger and service to the protection of American children. "The ceremony is next month," Agent Santos explained. "Sarah, you'll be meeting the President and speaking to the nation about the importance of protecting children from trafficking." Sarah examined the letter with the same careful attention she'd once given to memorizing her captors' routines. "Will I be able to talk about Daddy?" she asked. "That's exactly what they want you to talk about," Danny replied, kneeling down to her level. "Your father's story and how his work led to saving all these other children." Jennifer Sullivan watched from across the lobby as her daughter processed this news. The woman who had once been a grieving widow frantically searching for her missing child had found a strength she never knew she possessed. The family that had been shattered by James Sullivan's murder had been rebuilt into something stronger, bound together not just by love, but by a shared mission to protect other families from the same tragedy. The center itself had become a model for trauma-informed care for trafficking survivors. The building was designed to feel safe and homelike, with plenty of natural light, comfortable common areas, and individual counseling rooms that looked more like cozy living rooms than clinical offices. But most importantly, it was staffed by people who understood that healing from trafficking required more than just therapy. It required purpose, community, and the knowledge that their suffering had meaning. Sarah had become the center's unofficial ambassador, helping newly rescued children adjust to freedom and safety. She had an uncanny ability to recognize the specific type of trauma that came from trafficking, probably because she'd experienced it herself. When new children arrived, confused, frightened, and often hostile toward their rescuers, Sarah could reach them in ways that trained counselors sometimes couldn't. "I know it's scary," she would tell them during their first days at the center. "I know you don't trust anyone right now, and that's okay. But I want you to know that the bad things that happen to you don't define who you are. You're not damaged, you're not broken, you're a survivor, and that makes you stronger than you think." Danny often marveled at Sarah's resilience and wisdom. She had nightmares sometimes, and there were still certain sounds or smells that could trigger panic attacks. But she had learned to see her trauma as something that gave her the ability to help others, rather than something that limited her potential. The center's success had led to the establishment of similar facilities in 12 other states, all modeled on the James Sullivan Center's approach to survivor care. The Guardian Project had evolved into a permanent federal task force that had rescued over 800 children in its first 2 years of operation. But perhaps the most meaningful measure of success was simpler. Sarah Elizabeth Sullivan was happy. She attended regular school, played soccer, had sleepovers with friends, and argued with her mother about bedtime just like any other 8-year-old. The girl who had once been victim number 847 in a trafficking network's database had reclaimed her childhood while simultaneously becoming one of the most effective advocates for child protection in the country. As the day's activities began at the center, Sarah took her usual position helping younger children with their morning routines. Watching her guide a newly rescued 4-year-old through the simple act of choosing what to have for breakfast, Danny was reminded of something she'd once told him. "Daddy always said that the best way to honor the people we've lost is to make sure their sacrifice protects others." James Sullivan's death had been intended to silence an investigation and protect a criminal network. Instead, it had empowered his daughter to become the voice that brought that network down and created a legacy of protection for vulnerable children across the nation. The little girl who had signaled for help at a rest stop in Oklahoma had grown into a young woman whose courage continued to light the way home for children lost in darkness. Her father would have been proud. In the end, love had triumphed over evil, truth had conquered corruption, and a family that had been broken by tragedy had been made whole again through service to others. Sarah Elizabeth Sullivan had kept her promise to finish what her father started, and in doing so, she had ensured that his sacrifice would protect children for generations to come. The signals she had learned from her father, originally meant to call for help in her darkest hour, had become symbols of hope, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between a father's love and a daughter's courage. Sometimes the most extraordinary heroes come in the smallest packages. Sarah Elizabeth Sullivan was just 6 years old when she found herself trapped in a nightmare that would have broken many adults. But this remarkable little girl carried something more powerful than fear. She carried her father's love and the military training he'd shared with her before his death. When evil tried to silence her voice, she found another way to speak. When darkness threatened to swallow her hope, she became a beacon of light for others lost in the same shadows. Sarah's story reminds us that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about loving others more than we fear for ourselves. Her father, Sergeant James Sullivan, died protecting children he'd never met. His daughter lived to save hundreds more. In a world that often feels overwhelming and dark, Sarah's journey shows us that one person's refusal to give up can change everything. Her hand signals, taught by a loving father, became the language of liberation for countless children. Today, the James Sullivan Center stands as proof that from our deepest wounds can grow our greatest purpose, and that love, real, sacrificial love, always finds a way to triumph over evil, bringing light to the darkest places and hope to the most broken hearts. What moment in your own life taught you that love could overcome seemingly impossible circumstances? Have you ever witnessed a child's courage that reminded you of the strength we all carry within us? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.